This live stream is brought to you by the Water Corporation. Western Australia has its own unique climate, and with that comes its own set of challenges, particularly when it comes to creating a beautiful garden. Water Corporation has a wealth of resources to help master your garden, including a Waterwise plant directory, irrigation tips, and popular garden designs. To find out more, visit watercorporation.com.au/Waterwise.
Hello and welcome to the Garden Gurus Live. This is a very special edition. It is right across WA. Thanks to the Water Corporation, we have gardening the WA way, and gardening WA way is a very, very unique thing. We will spend some time this morning talking to some special guests about getting the right results and showing you how to do it properly. Most importantly, we're here to answer your questions. I'm Trevor Cochrane, and I have lived in WA my whole life and gardened here my whole life. And I don't think there's a single thing that I haven't come across as far as challenges go. So I'm hoping I can help you with your questions. Now, when you do want to ask a question, make sure that you actually tell us what suburb you're in or what town that you're tuning in from. We are coming to you live streaming across Facebook and YouTube, and we've got a huge 90 minutes of content coming up for you. Now, it's not all hard work. In fact, by sharing your garden questions, by participating, we have got some amazing prizes for you. Things like, the latest seeds. We'll have a whole bunch of questions where people will win that. We have got 3 copies of the West Australian Garden Guide, and I'm happy to sign that for you. We have got 3 copies of Delish, because one of the biggest things out there at the moment is growing food, and I'll be sharing some tips with you on how to grow it in a Waterwise way. And we have got 3 copies of the Rose, because by now you should have pruned yours, and the next month or 2 is going to be when things really start to happen. And roses can be an incredibly Waterwise plant if you've got the right rootstock, because there are rootstocks that work exceptionally well here. And if you set up the soil the right way. I'll explain all that. So if you've got any questions about any of those kinds of things, then please join us. Make sure you like the page, and of course join us and make sure that you're asking us all the questions that you would like. A bit later in the show, I'll give you a guide on how to plant smarter ahead of spring. If you want to know how to make the most of all the rain that we've been having, Matt Lunn, who is the CEO of the nursery and garden industry here in WA, he'll give you some of his top tips. And some of you may know Matt. He was with Curtin Radio for a long period of time. Extremely smart guy when it comes to plants, landscaping. He's done it all. He's a really, really cool fellow as far as all of his knowledge goes. And of course, we'll have Jen Bailey joining us a little bit later on. Bailey's is one of probably the best known gardening families in our state, multi-generational. And Jen will talk to us a little bit about Waterwise products and explain what goes into creating Waterwise products and why they are considered to be Waterwise. Okay, shall we get into some questions? I think we should. Right up front, we're going to head to Margaret River. Hello, Terry. You've asked a question. I have a question regarding a super shady spot. It's a raised bed. You've got good soil, good drainage, but it's extremely shaded, and you've pretty much got no direct sunlight. Now, it's being blocked out by large Tahitian lime in a bed directly in front of it. What can you plant in there? Now, you've tried large leafy greens. I'm getting the feeling that you're thinking along the lines of edibles. It certainly does get very hard. You've tried things like beetroot, which were very small, sweet potato, lots of green growth, but only very small potatoes. Leeks did quite well, but they took a year to reach maturity. Do I think normal potatoes might be okay? Well, look, potatoes really do love an open, sunny position. They also like free-draining soil. You could grow them in a shady spot. You're probably going to find, a bit like your sweet potatoes, that you're not going to get very big potatoes. So a lot of that growth goes into the leaves. And what the plant's trying to do is it's trying to get more sunlight. And so what happens is you get bigger, greener, leafier plants, and a lot less when it comes to the size of those potatoes that are underneath. In saying that, I think sweet potatoes is one of your best options, to be quite honest. And there's a couple of really good varieties out there. There is a nice yellow form out there called Tulip. It's not very common. You'd need to probably Google it. Pop into your local garden centre. I reckon that's the best way to get the right advice. And they can hunt it down for you and bring it in. Now's a good time to be getting your hands on sweet potatoes. Normal potatoes, I think it's going to be a bit hit and miss. And if I was going to grow them in the situation you're in, I'd probably grow them in pots. Best way to do it. And then you can basically fill the whole pot full of potatoes. Let's stay in the country. We're going to go to Donnybrook. Bernadette, hello. It's great to have you with us. You've got dozens of roos and rabbits that like to have breakfast, lunch and dinner on your properties. And you'd like to know any annual flowering plants that aren't agapanthus. Well, agapanthus can be, particularly in Donnybrook, a real weed. So it's definitely not the plant that you want to do. As far as annuals go, that are not going to be eaten by rabbits and roos, it's pretty difficult because they do love that soft new growth. What I would suggest you do is you look at something that's actually a little bit more resilient. So there's a lot of plants out there that are actually they're incredibly water-wise. So these are plants that you probably wouldn't have originally thought of putting in, but they're things like these cottage perennials, and there's a whole range of them. In fact, I've got some recommendations in from Joe at Guildford Town Nursery a bit later on, which will include some that will be ideal for your situation. Bernadette, you also asked the question, is now a good time to sow delphinium seeds? And the answer is absolutely. It's a brilliant time to get delphiniums growing, and you'll probably enjoy flower from them around about October, November. Now, this is a very important thing when it comes to WA. Now is the time to be planting those annual plants that are going to produce a lot of flower, because you've got all the winter rain coming through, and we've got soil saturation like we haven't had in many, many years. So they're going to do very, very well. And of course, by the time they come to finish flowering is when summer's setting in. It's time to rip them out, so you're not going to be pouring lots of good water on them to keep them going. So from my point of view, I think delphiniums would be a great thing to get in right at the moment. Let's keep moving along. We'll come back into the metro area. Hello, Fiona. How are you? You've got lots of fluffy black caterpillars eating your everlastings. Is there anything you can spray? Well, there is. There's some things that you can do either to try and repel them, or alternatively to actually get rid of them permanently. I would always recommend that you go for something very, very soft when it comes to trying to get rid of them. And caterpillars don't like chili, they don't like white pepper, and they do not like garlic. So there is some chili garlic sprays out there that you can spray over the foliage of your everlastings, because they will not last very long with the caterpillars you're talking about. Now, what I would recommend you do is you probably try that more as a repellent around the outside edge, but the ones that are in the middle, you're going to need to treat. Now, head to your local garden centre, because they've got some terrific solutions for those chewing insects. And there's some very good new technology when it comes to what I would describe as soft chemicals. So it is a chemical, uses natural ingredients. They're synthesized, but it's still a natural formulation. And they are incredibly effective when it comes to taking caterpillars out. So that's my recommendation to Fiona in Hammersley. Now we'll keep moving down the line. Oh, Lizzie from 2J sent through some photographs, and this is quite interesting. If you have a look at this, this is a 20-year-old apple tree, and I don't think I've ever seen a 20-year-old tree that size for a start. And you can see these big galls at the base of the tree, and it looks like it's something getting in there that's causing. Now, there's a lot of wasps that call that, so they actually plant a little egg in there, and it's a little caterpillar that sort of grinds its way in, and this grub can cause that galling. Once the galling's there, basically nutrient coming up from the roots doesn't pass by it very well, so the plant becomes very stunted. And my suggestion to you is probably not what you're thinking, Lizzie, but I'm going to suggest you rip this one out, because now is the time to be putting in deciduous trees. Apple trees are wonderful in many ways, because they do they do grow. They're obviously dormant during the winter, but they do grow well in the springtime. And once they get to summertime, they've basically got a fruit on. And apart from the moisture required for the fruit, the tree is actually able to sustain itself for a long period of time. And often, if you ever go past an old farmhouse or an old house in an old suburb that's about to be demolished or has been demolished, and you look around the outside to see what's remaining, there's usually a bougainvillea. There's probably an old rose on Fortuniana rootstock, which is that West Australian rootstock that we love and use all the time, or an apple tree. And generally it's an old granny or something like that. That's because they are very good at getting through the summer months. They do grow very strongly they flower and produce fruit, obviously during the spring, go dormant probably from January really through to March, April, and then you'll see them start to shed their leaves after that. Of course, through that period of time, you're picking great fruit. So I think that tree's got to come out, Lizzie. Sorry about that. So Shelley left a comment on the Water Corporation's page. Is it possible to pull apart old rose bushes to break off the dead wood around the roots and then replant the bush? Located in Brisbane in Queensland. Thanks, Shelley. Shelley, most roses that we have and we put into our gardens are generally grown in the ground first. So they're rootstocks that are grown in the ground, they're budded. New plant grows like that. They're dug in the winter time or the beginning of winter. And the idea is they're then usually transplanted into pots, and we grow them in pots. What I would be recommending you do is I would suggest, unless, if this is in a pot, yeah, sure, you can break up the roots, you can do that sort of stuff, and now is the time to do it. But if it's in the ground and it's in the right spot, I wouldn't really do anything. You can move them around, but I really wouldn't do an awful lot. I tend to think that most plants are a lot better off when you don't damage the root system. The root system needs to be strong and healthy and vigorous. And if it is, the plant doesn't, because the network of roots through the soil, the plant doesn't require huge amounts of water during stressful periods. And the second thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the plant is more vigorous, so therefore it's able to fight off pests and diseases better. Hope that helps. Ziva has asked us a question: when can I start planting my seedlings for summer? Well, typically, you'd be putting things like summer bulbs into the garden now. You'd definitely be putting spring flowering seedlings in, unless they're one of the really slow flowering varieties. So stocks and things like that, they can take a bit longer, and you would put them in now. And it's good to plant these sorts of plants now because they're going to establish using the winter rains. The amount of moisture that's in the air for most of us is such that it really does help these plants establish and get a good root system down without you having to use supplementary water. Of course, once we move into summer, well, we're in a situation where everything changes and we do need to start to supplement the garden's water requirements. But pretty much, particularly with the winter we've had here in WA, most of us are not going to need to turn our sprinklers on at all, even through spring. It might be the odd hand water as we start to get drier, but that's about all. Now, I'm really excited because we've got Genevieve Bailey joining us. Jen is the General Manager of Bailey's Fertiliser, and this is a multi-generational West Australian company that has had such impact on the broader community. It has been a really important part of WA, and Jen's one of the young leaders in our industry these days, and it's great to have her join us. Jen, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning, Trevor. I'm great, thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us this morning. It's great to catch up. Tell us a little bit about Bailey's first.
Yes, well, as you mentioned before, very long-standing family-run business. The company was actually started by my great-grandfather, so I'm the fourth generation in the business. Back in, I believe it was your nanning on the Great Southern Line, in around, well, I'm told 1926, but we've actually found photos of in 1916. So we gypped ourselves of 10 years there somehow. But yeah, very long-standing family business. We started off as more, I guess, produce merchants, and then sort of developed and went into distributing a range of agricultural products, and then developed into becoming manufacturers down the line. And so we manufacture all of our products here in Western Australia, down in Kwinana these days.
Wonderful, Jen. Your dad, Kim, used to supply my grandfather, Harry, who had a dairy farm in Mundajong, with the fertiliser that we used in the paddocks to keep the cows happy. So, it's a long family standing, and you've touched at some point pretty much every West Australian. There's something about Bailey, so that is, I think, a real standout in the business community when it comes to the garden industry. And that's been your commitment to staying on the front edge of things such as being environmentally friendly, making sure that fertilisers are not doing the wrong thing by our waterway, that we're not getting a lot of runoff. All that sort of innovation has been a big thing. But probably one of the most outstanding things has been the development of Waterwise products. You've really led the charge here in Western Australia when it's come to making sure that products are water-wise, and it goes from potting mixes right through to your mulches, even wetting agents. But tell me a little bit about what goes into creating a water-wise mulch or a water-wise soil improver.
Yeah, so it is quite a thorough process. People that are much smarter than me in our laboratory, our chemists and horticulturalists, they normally are the ones that carry out quite rigorous testing. So, say for instance, if we're introducing a new product that has soil amending properties that are water saving, we actually go through a process which is overseen by Smart Approved Watermark. So that is the watermark that you see those accreditations on your products. It shows that it's been proven to have water saving properties. And so, for instance, for a mulch, for instance, it will go through a range of laboratory testing to prove that application of it reduces water evaporation. Or for a soil amendment, for instance, amending, say, for instance, a sandy loam or an existing garden soil with it actually increases the water retention properties of the product.
Yep. And it's probably an important thing is to say that probably where the company started was very much instinctual, learnt off the land kind of knowledge. But today it's absolute science. You guys have a lab. You've got, effectively scientists sitting in there, agronomists, people who really know their stuff that are testing this thoroughly to make sure that when there's a stamp on there that says that it's water-wise, that it's actually genuinely saving water. And it's almost, it's cut down to actual percentages. You know how much water it's going to save by applying it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we really specialise in that, being, I guess, a WA business over here. It's so important for us to be producing products that have water saving properties and are improving, the nutrient holding and the water holding content of our soils over here. So we really specialize in that and try and make sure that all of our product development going forward is environmentally minded.
And Jen, that's a really important point. This has been an extremely abnormal year. We've had record rainfall in July. We were actually, a lot of people forget, it was only in June. We're actually 30 millimetres down on the average. So whilst we've had fairly good rain all the way through the year, the June average was right off where we needed to be. And we've got to remember that's the 30-year average. If we're going off the 100-year average, it would be a lot further off. So there's been this ongoing declining rainfall process. Now, from a generational point of view, this was probably first really noted by the Water Corporation back in about 1974, was they were looking at records from that period of time, and you could see the trail off as water actually started to become less and less in its inflow into our dams. And obviously rainfall was then the direct, common link to that whole thing. You guys have watched that and you've applied it to a lot of things you do, but this year is abnormal because we've got lots of rain. And it's an advantage for home gardeners to be planting early and be getting stuff into the ground. But there are a lot of things that you do need to take into account. For example, when we're putting fertilisers on, maybe we don't need to use as much, or maybe we need to use a little more frequently, but lesser volumes, or maybe we need to be using some of those controlled release technologies. And you guys are on the front edge of all that sort of stuff. Do you want to talk about how your local knowledge helps you service the needs of West Australian gardeners so much better?
Yeah, well, we definitely, like you said, Trevor, we want to make sure that the fertiliser is going where we want it to go and not ending up in our waterways. So it's important to make sure we're using the right products at the right time of year. So, for instance, your lawn, it's important at this time of year not to be applying really granular fertilisers, especially when we've had a lot of rain. and really waiting until the growing season when the plant can really take up that nutrients and put it to good use. And then also making sure that we're using products like wetting agents to make sure that, and applying wetting agents before we're applying fertilizers as well. So we make sure that we're breaking that surface tension, getting moisture into the root zone, and then the fertilizer obviously will be channeled into the root zone as well. So applying the right products at the right time of year is really important over here, as we know we've had issues with eutrophication and nutrients running off into our waterways. We want to avoid that as much as possible.
It's great advice. Now, there's a lot, you go through a lot to develop these products, but of course, ultimately, to get the Waterwise stamp of approval, the Water Corporation actually then put you through a series of trials as well. They test the product. Tell me a little bit about what you've got to go through to get that Waterwise stamp of approval.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, it is quite rigorous testing. So we will conduct a laboratory trial or a trial in a greenhouse, for instance. And what we're doing, it depends really on the type of product that we're testing, and the testing will be according to that. So like I said, with the mulch, for instance, we would test how it reduces evaporation. So an example, I guess, of a trial we would set up for a mulch would be we would get pots of soil, and then we would fill them to field capacity, which is, I guess, the maximum moisture content. And then we would apply a mulch at the recommended rate, and then we would leave them in an area under controlled conditions, but leave them in an area in the sun, say, for instance, for a week. And they would actually we would weigh how much the pots were before the trial and then after the trial. And so what that is actually showing us is how much water has been lost through evaporation. And so pots that had the mulch applied and pots that didn't have the mulch applied, then you get that direct, water saving result. And for soil amendments, we normally look at actually growing something that's quite sensitive to water loss. So like a leafy vegetable or leafy ornamental, like lettuce, for instance. And then showing how the plant is affected, if it's amended with the soil amendment or not amended, showing how it actually performs with reduced water rates. And we look at it too, what's called like a wilting point. So when it starts to wilt, that's when we'll water it again and see how it performs. And so what we would expect to see, an amended soil, you'll be able to maintain that plant health, but with a much reduced water rate.
Yeah. Jen, look, you know what? I'm always astounded. I think I can honestly say thank you very much to Kim, your father, because it was really his belief in the Garden Gurus and the importance of the Garden Gurus in communicating to the West Australian public back in 2002 when we first started. And it's consistent with the Bailey's family's commitment broadly to gardeners in Western Australia and to helping people get the right information and really doing things. So thank you. Thanks very much to Kim. Pass that on to your dad for me. And thank you so much for joining us this morning and explaining this. It's a really interesting insight. I've got lots of questions coming through, so I'll keep moving on with people doing that. But thanks again for coming and joining us on the show this morning.
No trouble. Thanks for having me.
See you, Jen. We'll see you again soon. It's a really fascinating thing. They're a great West Australian family, and if you were to jump on the Water Corporation's website, what you want to do is go and have a look at Waterwise certified products. So you'd go to watercorporation.com.au/Waterwise, and you'll see this list of products, and all of these products have been through this rigorous testing process. So if you're using these as the basis to when you're setting your garden up, your garden is going to use less water. And that's probably, you probably don't feel it now, but when you will feel it is a little bit further down the line, because it's not that far away that we'll be back into warm weather. And as soon as you're in that situation, you want to keep the water required to keep your plants happy to an absolute minimum. And so keep your eye out. Go and check out that webpage. It's watercorporation.com.au/Waterwise. Now, don't forget, if you like what we're doing, hit the like button. It's very much appreciated. It shares it with your friends. and we'll obviously be able to help them as well. Let's go to a few questions. They're continuing to flow through. Gavin is from Kenwick. Now, I reckon Gavin's one of our mates that's followed us for a period of time. And he's made a statement here. He says the only plants that really need water after the rain in April to late October are food crops. And even then, Gavin, I would say that's it's only when we go through dry patches. It's a good point. He said watering ornamental plants during this period of time means that you have really bad soil problems that need to be corrected. And what he's basically said is, what should I be using on my soil? So again, Gavin, I would suggest you head straight back to the Water Corporation's website. Have a look at the Waterwise product range, because if you are to actually have a look at that website, you will see there are a number of products. And the first thing I would be doing is talking about soil amendment. And there's one on their list. I'm flicking through the list here. It's called Soil Solver. You'll love it. It's a clay product. And this has been basically created as a soil amendment by a guy who was a farmer, and he recognised the value of kaolin clay. Now, there's different types of clays. This particular kaolin clay is quite common. There's variations in kaolin clay, but this particular deposit of kaolin clay, when it's mixed with rock minerals, when it's mixed with silt, and that's what Soil Solver is, at the right mix, and then you incorporate it into a sandy soil, it transforms the sandy soil from being I suppose, a very free draining soil to something that's more like loam. And for exotic plants, loam is probably the ideal growing medium. So one is the plants grow better, but two, and most importantly, they don't require as much water to look good all year round because the water's not moving through the soil too fast. It's being held in around that surface roots of the soil. So, Gavin, my recommendation is probably to head to the Waterwise products site on the Water Corporation's website, have a look at Soil Solver, and then head to your local, I suppose, good garden centre. And again, when you're on the Water Corporation's website, you can find Waterwise garden centres. That should help you. Let's go a little bit away from soil for the moment, and we'll head to Bunbury. Misty's in Bunbury. Can I dig up my frangipani? Well, right now is the perfect time to do that, Misty. So it's basically as soon as frangipanis become dormant, and it doesn't matter how big they are. So a few years ago for the Garden Gurus TV show, I went to a couple of old houses that were being knocked down in inner city areas with magnificent 50, 60, 70-year-old frangipani trees in them. And we went and we dug these frangipanis out, and we literally took them. And one of the things that you do, which is really unusual, is that normally in the transplant process, you would lift the plant and avoid root damage. So you're trying to reduce the amount of root damage, and you still want to do that with your frangipani. But what you do when you normally transplant a plant is you get it straight into the new hole or into the pot or wherever its new home is going to be. But with a frangipani, you actually take it out and then you lay it down and you let it sit. And ideally let it sit overnight. Now, what you're wanting to do is wherever the roots were damaged, you want them there'll be a white sap that comes out of those roots. You want that to basically seal. And once it's sealed, you pop the plant back into the ground. Interestingly enough, as much as they're quite an exotic tropical looking plant, frangipanis come from a family of plants called Apocynaceae. And the Apocynaceae family includes things like Diplodenias and Mandevilleas and a whole bunch of plants that have this very sort of creamy sap. Now, the sap's not good for you to get on your hands, on your skin or anything like that. But one thing that it is very good at doing is moving slowly through the plant. And this stops the plants from translocating moisture from the roots to the leaves quickly. And by doing that, you reduce the demand of water. So this is a family of plants that actually grows in a very good water-wise way here in WA. So frangipani, can you dig it up? Absolutely. Right now is a good time to do it, Misty. I hope that helps. Nick, how do you grow big tomatoes? Well, mate, the trick there is put lots of good organics into your soil. So tomato plants are very fast growing. Once the best time of the year to plant them is in the next 2 weeks. So as we're starting to move into spring, You don't need to, because you're putting them into good soil and we've got good moisture around, you don't need to water them. You just need to let them get established now. And as soon as we get into warmer weather towards the middle end of September, you'll start to see them really motor away. Probably towards mid to late October, if you're planting now, you're going to see your first fruit, and that fruit will be big. Now, boosting growth is an important thing, Nick. So add some fertilizer as you're going along. Really important thing to do. And folks, if you're going to grow tomatoes, great advice for you. But if you've got friends who are going to grow tomatoes, remember, hit the like button, because your friends will see what you're watching at the moment, and that gives us the ability to answer more questions and help more people out. And that's all being done because of the Water Corporation and their ability to support us to bring this to you. Now, I've got a very important fellow joining us. He is the CEO of the nursery and garden industry of WA. Matt Lunn he'll be very familiar to many of you. He spent many years on Curtin Radio helping West Australians. He's a professional landscaper, horticulturalist. He knows WA better than most people. And he is joining us this morning. Good morning, Matt. How are you?
Good morning, Trevor. Yeah, very well indeed.
It's great to see you, mate, and thanks for joining us this morning. We had a pretty spectacular dump of rain over the month of July. I know we've got some more heading our way tonight, I think it is. It's been the wettest July in 26 years. But there's a very important message in this, whether we're going to have a wet July or not. You don't have to turn your sprinklers on in winter. In fact, you're not allowed to.
No, I mean, look, it's funny you say that, Trevor. I was out in Victoria Park the other day, and there was a garden there with their their retic on outside and their virgin. You just start to wonder where people are still going with irrigation. And I think that's partly because I came here in '94 from London, and everyone was watering twice a day, 7 days a week, with those old style irrigation controllers set up in the garage. And I think many people perhaps haven't gone to that next stage in using Wi-Fi controllers, using apps on phones. We've come a long way since '94, and people sometimes forget to actually turn off their retic. It costs them money, and that's what's silly about it all. Not only are we wasting water, but it's costing you money to run to run your retic. So no, we certainly don't need to turn them on.
We learned a lot, didn't we, Matt? When back in those days, we were always conscious about just keeping that topsoil moist. But of course, what we did was we encouraged our plants to grow shallow root systems. They weren't putting their roots down deeper. So every time it got hot, they would show signs of stress. So we turned the sprinklers back on again. And one of the things that we learned was actually through technology and through getting smarter at what we did was it's better to give 1 or 2 good drinks a week during the season when it's required, and encourage the plants to send their roots down deep.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you've been talking this morning about getting plants in. This is, as you say, the perfect time to be putting plants in with those rains. But also, it's that iteration. There's that old saying that if you spend $1 on a plant, you spend $10 on soil improvements, and and that's particularly true when we're using ornamental species. But if you do set yourself up properly, and this is the sort of thing that I'm doing at the moment in my own home garden, I'm getting the garden right, ready for summer. So I'm doing a lot of design work, reviewing how the garden performed. I'm looking back at photos, and in particular, I'm just making plants that perhaps didn't do so well. I'm giving them a helping hand now by setting up the right retic, a bit of soil improvement, mulching, obviously. But more importantly, as you quite rightly say, if you put that little bit of extra money into the planting hole, that plant won't wilt, hopefully, and you won't be bunking on the water. You need to, roots have got noses, Trevor. It's as simple as that. They'll go and search for water. So if you can try and drive those roots deeper, the plants then withstand those long summer days.
Oh, it's funny you should say that. I was just talking to somebody the other day, a scientist, talking about soil amendments and how plants are amazing at sending roots to find where water is. They will send them a long way to find where a water source is. And for anybody with the those old ceramic pipes or clay piping systems for their sewerage, which are pretty old and out of date these days, but for those maybe in the hills, they'll know that it doesn't take long for a tree to find a little gap in one of those pipes and find its way in. So It's a bit of a challenge. So, Matt, your top 5 tips for people right now to get the best results for spring and summer. Do you want to run through it? You've obviously mentioned planning for a start.
Yeah, look, planning is really important. There comes a point where after March, April, we're starting to see that autumn weather coming into play, and that's the time to really be focusing on getting the garden actually ready for summer. So obviously we're in August now. I've taken stock of some of the garden beds. I've had a really good look. I've got a great example here in my own home garden here in Gidgee. I grow a number of euphorbias. Some of the larger varieties, I just love the big flowers that they produce, those lovely sort of burnt, almost yellow colours and oranges. And then below that, I've got Salvia lacantha, really great Waterwise plant. And, it performed really, really well, but it was missing something. And I'm going to add a little annual gemstone blue. And that will just pick it up. So that's the sort of thing I do at this time of the year. I'm going through the garden, having a bit of a look through. I've lost a Grevillea moonlight, which got knocked over by some very heavy winds. Yep. I lost, sadly, a lovely Leucadendra Inca, one of the yellow varieties. That's obviously got to be replaced. So I'm going through now, having a good look at the garden and just going out buying plants, which I love.
Because garden centres right at the moment, they're all being stocked full. I ducked into one of my locals, Guildford Town Nursery, which is not too far from you as well, and just brimming with the most amazing plants at the moment. This is a great time to start to get out into your local garden centre.
Oh, perfect time. As you say, we're just about to come into this. Yesterday with some warmer weather, and that tends to drive people into garden centres. Mm-hmm. But the garden centres themselves have been, they recovered after COVID to a certain degree. There was a bit of a shortage of plants, Trevor, at one point this time last. This time last year, they've recovered. So we've got lots of stock going in there, lots of new varieties. I was at Kings Park only the other week looking at the new breeding programs they've got up there, and some of the new varieties of these Grevilleas are just stunning.
Yes.
And the garden centres are now starting to stock these types of new plants. So it's not just some of the older stuff that we used to see. We're seeing new stuff, Trev, and that's boding well for saving water.
Speaking of saving water, and we talked about irrigation, nobody should have their irrigation on at all at the moment. But one of the problems we often have when we start the season is we'll hit the switch on the clock or these days on the app, and you turn it on and you think, oh, everything's all good and fine. Only to find as you're driving out to work in the morning that suddenly there's a big stream of water heading down the road because there's a couple of broken sprinklers. The lawnmower hit it once, or one's broken, or there's a hole in a pipe. It's amazing how these things happen during the winter months. What's your advice with regards to avoiding that?
Look, it's a great time to, just like putting your car in for a yearly maintenance checkup, you need to do that with your irrigation. And that's not just turning the system on. Often I will periodically, because I've got a bore here at home that I'm storing water in a large tank, I will actually do a water check the pH. So I'll send my water off for analysis and just see how I'm traveling there, because the pH in the water can affect how plants grow. But ultimately, turn on the system and just have a look, because certain plants have perhaps got larger, and where there were sprinklers which were easily getting across a garden bed, they're perhaps not. And you often see that in gardens where one plant right at the back now isn't getting sufficient amount of water and it starts to die, and people think, well, I'm turning the retic system on, it must be. No, it's because perhaps there are foliage or other things in the way. So it's a great chance to just test the system, make sure there's good reach of water across the garden bed. Just make sure if the pressure is really too high and you're seeing that misting, well, you need to reset all that up. Perhaps you've added sprinklers on and the pressure's too low, so maybe you need to add a new station on to get the so that the water, that the irrigation system should be running at its potential. Looking for breakages, obviously, that's a classic one. And also one that a lot of people forget to do is where you've got your solenoids, just make sure you know where they are. Sometimes when you get that break in summer, you have no idea where you put your solenoid. So it's a good idea just to refresh your memory, perhaps put a marker stick, or even what you really should do when you're planning your retic is actually have a scale drawing or some form of design for it. So time, as you say, just to go through, clean out nozzles, sprinklers, just make sure everything's tip top before when you need to turn it on.
Yeah, I know one of the things that I've just recently done is I've got a section of my garden that's got subsurface irrigation, so drip irrigation,
Yeah.
and I've obviously got a filter. Everybody's got to have a filter on their drip irrigation system, and I thought, well, look, I'll do a quick run through. I just went through and pulled the filter out. Absolutely clogged up with rubbish in there. I couldn't believe the amount of silt and also iron buildup that I'd had there. Took it out, gave it a good clean. And I know that line will work properly now that we move into, or as we move into the summer period.
Yeah, definitely. And look, it's really critical again where you've got those drip systems in play. I'm just about to put one in my vegetable garden. You've got a flush valve at the far end too.
Yep.
So once that station comes on, it'll flush out, clean out the line, and then it'll come to pressure. So yeah.
And spring is just around the corner, so a lot of people will be starting to look at their garden. Plants. We've been through a cold, wet period, and plants were sitting very stagnant. Lawns the same, but we're going to want to give them a bit of a boost. So feeding's an important thing, but you've got to do it the right way, don't you?
Yeah, look, and I was interested to listen to you talking to Jen, and we're now much more conscious about leaching fertilizers into our soils and eventually into our catchments and into our rivers. So I use a couple of ways of feeding my plants. I've got 3 or 4 great worm farms here, which the worm we, as well, I refer it to, actually do a great job in picking plants up. Seaweed-based products are really great to use at this time. Annuals will start to be pushing. I'm starting to see some of my salvias just starting to break and new growth. But some of the slow release based fertilizers is where I go always. And I'll be starting to feed up things like agapanthus you were talking about earlier. Native plants, I've just cleaned up a lot of my kangaroo paws, and then I'll just be giving them a proper native fertilizer, and that will take them through. So I go for a 9 or 12 for release, and that'll just take them through the summer. And that's it. So it's perfect time to be doing it. And things like sick trees, obviously, as well.
Yeah. Look, there's so much obviously going on, the change of the season, but using you make a really good point about the right fertilizer for the right job, and also those longer, slow release fertilizers. Plants are like us; they feed a small amount every day. If you just go and give them a big boost like we used to do in the old days, and you could make the mistake of giving too much or not enough. Nowadays, technology has allowed us to be able to apply the fertilizer at whatever it is, 50, 60 grams per square metre, and it'll feed over a 4, 6, 9-month period, which is a really good way to go. One of the things that there are so many people passing comments at the moment, this is one that'll affect you as much as I know it does in my garden as well, is at the moment there's so much germination going on of weed seeds. We've got so much weed seed, and mulching is a good way to reduce evaporation, as Jen raised before, but it's also a good way to get on control of those weeds, isn't it?
I've got paddocks that actually surround my property, Trevor, and the cows also have hay and things like that. And that then, when we've had these rains here in Gidgee, it just flows across the top of the surface because only a short few 100 mil below is just rock. And I've got oats coming up everywhere. It's driving me nuts, so I make sure this will be going through and mulching, etc. But mulch. Mulch, there's all different types of mulch out on the market, but the most important thing when I talk about mulch to people is preserving the moisture below, but also making sure that you're reducing fluctuating temperatures within the soil profile. Because once you put that mulch over the top, you're keeping a much cooler root zone. And the plants, therefore, aren't sort of getting cooked. And they do. The roots will get pretty warm below 100 mil. So having that layer of mulch acts as almost like a little bit of a duvet over the top just to stop those fluctuations of heat, particularly in January when we get those 40-plus days. So mulch, you should always cover the surface. And, if you read any permaculture book, there are about 6 or 7 important things you do. And always on there is make sure the surface is not bare. Cover it.
Yeah, and look, obviously, it's reducing moisture loss, as you pointed out. It's reducing weed seed germination, and now is a terrific time to get out and be mulching the garden. But probably after you've gone through some of those processes that you raised before, you want to make sure your irrigation's right. You want to make sure that the soil is rich and healthy and growing well. And then when you're mulching, probably do it straight after you've put out your new plants into the garden.
That's it. It's a simple process. It's what I'm doing now at the moment. I work through that process, going through each bed, cleaning it up, feeding it, just making sure the retic works, and then finally just almost bedding it down for summer. And that's it. Once I turn that retic on in October, November, my main focus is making sure the garden stays alive. I'm not thinking about going out and now starting buying plants. I've done all my prep work. Now I will really just keep the garden ticking with a bit of moisture and perhaps some liquid feeding. After that, that's it. I stay inside in the cool.
Matt, absolutely fantastic advice, and I really appreciate you taking time out. I know you're such a busy guy, and you've got that property up there. You're doing all this great work with the nursery and garden industry. It's fabulous to have you join us this morning. Thanks so much for your time.
Trevor, thank you for your support too. Take care.
Not a problem, mate. Thanks. Now, look, there are so many questions coming in. It was great to have Matt on the show, and he's probably triggered a few people out there putting some more questions through. There's stuff coming through from YouTube. We've got things coming through from the Water Corporation's Facebook page, and of course from ours. Terry in Margaret River is a good example. She's prepping her soil for spring planting, exactly what Matt just recommended. Basically, there's weeds out, there's some produce out, probably the end of the winter crops, adding some good fertiliser, adding some mulch, leaving it for 2 weeks, and then planting. Perfect way to do it. And of course, you're going to test your retic, but your plan is to do that later in spring. You know what? Perfect timing. I think that this is one of those things, all these points that Matt has raised here in WA, if we do them in that order, the results that you will get will be outstanding. But of course, you'll do it without using huge amounts of water. And we all have to make the effort to make sure that we remain water wise. It is the West Australian way. We have led the country in many ways. We've led the world when it's come to water conservation. We need to keep up the good work. Now, remember, we want to hear from you. So please tell us, what are you doing in your garden this weekend? Today, because it's going to rain this evening, today is a great day to get out. Tell us in the comments section what you're doing. Share your tips maybe. Jim Jazz 90 has contacted us on YouTube. Has said that he's weeding. All the rain has turned the backyard into a forest of weeds. Now, Jim, I reckon that would be just challenging the majority of us at the moment. Now, there's a couple of things. If you've got weeds in garden beds, so there's 2 places you're going to get them, lawn or garden beds. If you've got weeds in garden beds, the best way to control them is, just as was suggested then, is not to worry about going and pulling them all out and hurting your back as you're going along and feeling like you're a bit bitter and twisted at the end of the day because the garden's challenged you too much physically. The best thing to do, grab some newspaper, wet it down, lay it over the top of the garden beds, and then put 100 mil layer of a big chunky mulch, a Waterwise mulch. And that is, again, I'll just steer you back to the Water Corporation's website. You can find out what a Waterwise mulch is by travelling to that website and checking out the Waterwise product section. It is really a very important thing. It's watercorporation.com.au/Waterwise. That will help you, Jim. And remember, we've got prizes to give away as well. So leave your questions in the comments section. The YouTube questions are flowing in quite well. Peter actually has got a really good one. What indoor plants are water-wise? He doesn't have a garden, but is interested in having some plants that are water-wise in the house. Now, I'm gonna take you back a little step. So there are a lot of plants that originate from rainforest environments. So rainforests typically have more than 1 metre of rainfall a year. Generally, some of them around that sort of 2 metre mark. And those plants that grow in the forests underneath tend to grow big, broad leaves. So a lot of the plants that we think of as indoor plants typically would grow in the under canopy of a rainforest. So they're getting lots of moisture. The big leaves are looking for light, and they're very good in an indoor situation. The trick in this situation is probably turning around and saying, okay, the plant is going to require a certain amount of water. What I want to do is contain the water that I have the best possible way. So self-watering pots, those are pots generally that have a container on the bottom and a wicking system where the roots can draw moisture up so you don't ever have water flow out. Every single drop of water that the plant gets, it's able to use. They're absolutely perfect. The second thing is good quality potting mixes. always look for the red tick. Look for the Waterwise stamp. It is the giveaway because it'll have a wetting agent in there. It'll have lots of good organics that have been composted. This means that moisture stays in the soil longer and it stays available for the plant's roots to take it up. These things are vitally important. There are some plants that you can use indoors that are incredibly good, and the cactus and succulents are a great collection. As long as you've got a bright spot, cacti will do very well. Succulents can do incredibly well, and again, going back to maybe some of the most popular varieties that are out there at the moment, but things like Sansevierius, which are known commonly as mother-in-law's tongue, they are a snake plant. They're a plant that originates from South Africa and Mozambique, and you'll find them growing in really sandy, poor quality soils as an under canopy plant, but more in sort of not a rainforest environment, but more in a shrub, quite hard environment. These plants do really well indoors. And interestingly enough, NASA did some research on a whole bunch of these types of plants and found that they're one of the best plants to take toxins out of the atmosphere and convert it into fresh oxygen, which is vitally important in our houses, which is why so many of us in the last few years have gotten back into houseplants. So Sansevierius is a mother-in-law plant. Cacti and succulents, if you've got brightly lit positions. If you're thinking of palms, there's one called the Rafus palm or the lady's finger palm. Absolutely sensational, Peter. Really, really good plant. So I hope that helps. There's lots of options there, and obviously make sure that you're gardening in a water-wise way. Good soils, self-watering pots, these things all make a big difference. Julie is coming to us from the southwest, just near Bunbury. She's got 20 jacarandas at different levels of growth. Now, they've been shielded from wind, they get morning sun. What do I use for feeding? Also, there's some stalks that look dead but are being grow alone. Okay, so you've got a little bit of dieback occurring on some of these plants. Now, that's not an unusual thing when you've got a plant that comes from a warmer environment typically. Jacarandas come from South America, and they do not like it too cold. They definitely do not like frosts, and it will cause some dieback. Now, right at the moment, I wouldn't suggest you cut them back. But once you start to see a little bit of bud swelling on the stems, I'd remove all the dead wood. So that's the first thing. As far as food goes, they're pretty much dormant at the moment. They're not going to grow a lot, and there's no benefit in throwing fertilizer down when the big risk of that is that we get lots of rain and it causes leaching or it causes runoff. That nutrient leaves the garden or leaves the plant that you wanted it for, doesn't do any benefit at all. So you're just spending money for no reason. I would suggest you hold off, and then around about the second week of October, we're starting to see some movement in the plants. The roots are starting to activate, the soil's warmer, and the fertilizer can be taken up. So that's when you would do it. And when it comes to fertilizer, controlled release fertilizers. They are what we need to use here in WA. Vitally important. Now, speaking of where Matt lives, Gidgee Ganup, Claudia has joined us. She's got a great question. She's got a passion fruit vine. Now, she's not sure how old it is. It's been a great producer, but lately, and she's mentioned that the rats have been getting to the fruit. Leaves are now falling off. It's looking rather bare. And what could be the problem? There's a few things I'll share with you about passion fruit. First of all, passion fruit typically are productive for 5 to 7 years. After that, you'll find they basically get a virus, to be quite honest, and it causes them to become woody, and it's pretty much the end of their life. That's the typical black passion fruit varieties that we all have. So always look at passion fruit as a 5-year proposition. You're going to get the best results probably from year 2 to 3, and then year 4, you'll get really good crops. Year 5, really good crops, and then you'll start to see a decline generally after that. As far as fruit goes, great. There's a lot of varieties that produce fruit during the winter. They don't necessarily colour up, and the longer the fruit's on the vine, the more risk there is that rats or other pests can be attracted to the fruit. Now, because they're not black doesn't mean that they're not ripe. It just means that there's not been enough sunlight for them to ripen, and we've just had a record month of cloudy days. So now we start to see a little bit of sun coming out. You'll start to see some of the fruit start to colour quite quickly. So pick it first. With regards to the leaves falling off and the plant looking bare, it is purely cold weather. It's all it is. Passion fruit are a tropical plant. They love warm conditions. They'll tolerate cold winters. They don't like freezing cold winters. And we've had a freezing cold winter. And I think Gidgee, I could be wrong, but I think there's been a couple of frosts up there already. It's going to knock your passion fruit around. And the first thing it'll do is drop its leaves. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to regenerate as soon as we start to get some warm weather. At that point in time, I would look at going through and trimming back the plant and getting some shape into it, taking out any old wood, so any dead sticks or anything else, remove that. Wherever you see fresh new growth, then leave that alone. Let that become the new leaders, the new fruit producers for later in the warm season. There is a couple of things that you can do. Putting a straw mulch around the base of your passion fruit, now not directly up against the stem, but in a base about 500 mils and a big arc around the base of the main trunk or stem that comes out of the ground, and then putting a little bit of chicken manure over the top of that straw will warm the soil and it'll get it growing a little bit quicker. I hope that helps. Emmeline has joined us. She's got olive trees and she's planted the Dimatina Jade Orange Coral. Now, this is a hybrid Mandevilla. It is absolutely beautiful. And she's got it under one of the only olive trees that has leaves. It's got good drainage, some sun. What can I do to bring them back? It sounds like they're struggling. Olives generally, they do like it cold. They need it to be cold to produce good crops, but they can tolerate extremely hot, dry conditions. So what you'll probably find is that when you get it really cold, the olive might drop a bit of foliage. That's the first thing. As far as the Diamantina, now let me explain what that is. That's a Mandevilla. It's a very special, it's a combination or a cross species Mandevilla. It was introduced in 2016 by the French Mandevilla breeders, Lannes at one of the great flower shows in Europe. And it's been an absolute popular, really, really incredibly popular plant. But in our environment, it really does want it to be warmer. This is a plant that loves it warmer. And I mentioned earlier on plants with that sort of milky sap, that creamy sap. This is one of those. So it's a member of the same family as things like frangipanis, for example, or another good example of a plant that can tolerate extreme conditions and not have any kind of problems is another member of that family, which I would recommend you consider, and that is the Diplodenia. The oleander is another member of that family, and they'll survive anything, and particularly coastal. So you can get dwarf olees and you can get large oleanders. Once they're established, they require no water to look great and produce great flowers. This is the same from the same family. So it's a pretty tough plant, but it loves it hot. And that's the key. That's what's going on here, is that those plants that have gone through that, they want a nice hot summer, they get to a cold, wet winter, they struggle a bit. So what can you do? You can probably go and give them a little bit of a feed, but I wouldn't do it right now because they're not going to do an awful lot with it. They're pretty much dormant. Leave it for another 2 to 3 weeks. Once they start growing, then you start encouraging them to do more with it. Now, remember, hit your like button. We have been going for a good hour now, and we've got so many good questions coming through. But hit the like button, share it with your friends, encourage them to join us. There's a lot of really good questions flowing through, and I'm looking at some of them as they come through. And with spring just around the corner, it's perfect time for you to actually win one of our packet seeds or one of our books that we're giving away today. There's some great prizes. One of the things that, and I know this is probably going to sound a bit strange to you. So when we think of Waterwise, we think of native plants, right? And it makes a lot of sense. But Australia is a big continent. In fact, when we have the terminology natives, many of the native plants we get come from breeders in northern New South Wales that have very wet summers. So sometimes those plants are not best adapted to our environment. But there are other environments in the world that have very similar conditions to ours. And probably one of the most popular flowering bulbs in the world is the tulip. And everybody thinks of tulips as being Dutch, but they're not. Tulips actually originate from Turkey, where Turkey has long, hot, dry summers with no rainfall. But once the winter rains come, the bulbs of the tulips, because they've adapted to grow when there is moisture, take off and they start to grow. So growing spring flowering bulbs makes an awful lot of sense, because basically once they finish flowering, they'll die back. As they're dying back, the water level is actually declining. These plants have adapted to environments like ours. So maybe you've got some tulips that are in flower, or maybe, I know in my garden, my tulips are still not there. The bulbs are starting to show some flower buds, but we're not quite there. But we have a lot of daffodils and jonquils coming through at the moment. Send us a photo of your favourite flowering spring bulb and be in the running to win one of these prizes. Hopefully that little story helps you think a little bit about it. Oh, I should say to you too, now is not the time to be planting spring flowering bulbs. It's definitely not the time. You do that in the autumn as we're going into winter. So think of the seasons a little differently. If you were going to plant, if you wanted some spring colour, but you wanted to plant something right now and you wanted to do it from seed, I would be recommending, this is probably this weekend in Perth and north, probably to the Midwest, is the last weekend you could put down everlasting seeds. So everlastings are absolutely beautiful West Australian iconic plants. The wildflower season we are about to experience, or are experiencing at places like Coal Seam Conservation Park right now, is unbelievable, and it's inspiring people to get out and plant these. But you've really got a window of opportunity, because it's got to be during rainfall. You don't want to be putting them down when you've got to supplement the water. They won't grow very well. They'll decline. So what I would be recommending you do right at the moment is this weekend, head to your local garden centre, get a packet of everlasting seeds and pop them down if you want some spring colour. They are absolutely sensational. All right, I'm going to get back to your questions because they're flowing through. Keep sending us questions in because I want to answer them. I'm not going to go until I've got all your questions answered. Fiona has asked a question. She's in Serpentine. It's extremely wet at the moment. Can't walk out on the lawn to get to the garden. It's too wet to pull weeds and too wet to mow. My lavender hedge has died. I don't know how or where to start. Is it okay to start cleaning up after it's dried out enough? Well, Fiona, I'm in the Perth Hills as well, so I'm in Kalamunda, and I have never seen my garden as wet as it is. And I've been sloshing around in some of the areas where it's never been that sloshy. So I know exactly what you're going through at the moment. I'm sure most people do. You need to let it dry. And I found in the last 2 days that just with the rain backing off and a bit of sun out, suddenly the moisture is sinking in a little bit deeper. There's obviously, it's not being supplemented all the time, so suddenly the top's drying out. The lawn is suddenly looking a little bit better. But plants like lavender that loves hot, dry conditions is going to struggle just at the moment. And I put in a little hedgerow of them in one of my vegetable garden beds, just a border around the outside for a little bit of formality. And typically, those plants would have probably taken off and grown really well during a normal winter. But this isn't a normal winter. They have sat there and they are dead still. And I'm not going to see any growth from them, I don't think, until probably October. And I'm not going to see any flower this year when I'd normally have seen flower probably in October. I'm not going to see flower till December. So it's a strange time of the year. This is definitely not the time to be getting out there and sloshing around. You don't really need to do an awful lot at the moment unless you are planting. So unless you're putting new plants in, take advantage of the rainfall. And we've got it, it's on its way in. I can see the clouds moving in now. The sun has just disappeared behind the clouds. So we know we're going to get some more rain late today. And that is a good time to have had plants in the ground. So heading to your garden centre straight after this show is a good idea. Now, Ricky Bobby from YouTube, what a good name, Ricky Bobby. How do you fix frost damage? Well, you don't fix frost damage, Ricky, but there is something you can do to alleviate frost damage. And what I mean by that is that there are some products that you can apply over the foliage of plants that will reduce the damage that's done. And there are some things that you can do that if you're going to get frost, that you can reduce the amount of damage. So once the damage is done, the only thing to do is to wait until you've got through the winter, through this cold period, and then to trim back at that point any dead wood. That will stimulate new growth. If you're anticipating, so if we end up in a situation where we have, and August is a classic for Western Australia, for us to get quite severe frosts at times. If we were to get 3 or 4 nights of clear skies, we will get frosts. So if you see that happening, most of the damage done by frost is done somewhere between about 4:30 and 6 a.m. So it's just as the sun is starting to appear, you will see suddenly the temperatures will drop, usually 2 or 3 degrees. And that's when you get the freezing of any moisture that's on the outside of the plant. The trick at that point in time is, if you're going to do anything, give your sprinklers a quick run. Give them like 1 minute. You don't need a lot. You just want to make sure you melt that moisture away, get it to run off quickly before it freezes. And if you can avoid the crystallizing and the frost in the plant tissue, you'll be fine. That's a really good thing. There is something else that's done by grape growers. They use that product sea salt, so seaweed extract. And it has been proven that it's exceptionally good to apply over the foliage of new stems. So in the case of grape, professional grape growers, as the new growth comes out, the last thing you want is any damage. But there are late season frosts. So what they do is every 3 or 4 days, they'll apply a foliar feed, so sea salt, over the foliage of the plant. And I can't tell you scientifically why this works, but it does stop the plant from getting frost damage. So that's a little trick as well. So much information. I hope this is helping. Liquid Blake from YouTube. Okay, Liquid Blake. What's the best compact blueberry plant varieties for a coastal environment? It's a good question. There are a number of, so I'm based right here in Perth, and just north of Perth, there's an area called Yanchep, and one of the world's best blueberry breeders has been based up there. So many of the popular varieties that are now appearing have actually originated from this breeding work done by this guy just north of Perth. Those varieties are producing very large blueberries and big crops of them, and that's what you want to be looking for. The variety that's best suited for a coastal environment depends where you're located. So if you're a little bit further north, there are some that are a lot better for warmer conditions. If you're further south, there's others that are better for that as well, and obviously they're cooler conditions. My recommendation is go and talk to your local Waterwise garden centre. It's the best advice I can give you. They have horticulturalists there. They can give you the advice. They can show you the varieties. They can talk about the size of the fruit, how much fruit each plant produces. So a mature, let's say, if we were to go for one of the Nellie Kelly blueberry varieties, they've got a couple of dwarf varieties they use. One of them is a variety that was introduced to Australia in the 1920s. It was a compact variety. Really good plant, but didn't get big enough for commercial growers, so they never took it on. So it sat there, and one day a plant breeder looked at it and went, you know what, that's exactly what a home gardener wants. They want a small compact bush that produces a large volume. This was, in this particular instance, a variety that produces 4 kilos of blueberries a year. So that ended up being commercialised, and you'll now find that in good garden centres. Hopefully that helps. Craig's in Mandurah. Hello, Craig. How do you use a rainwater tank in your garden? Look, you know what? Rainwater tanks typically, if you've got a very small garden, you're probably going to have a 5,000 litre rainwater tank or something like that. It's not really a source of long-term water supply unless you're using something like drip irrigation or subsurface irrigation. It's a really good way to collect water. Rainwater tanks are brilliant for flushing toilets. There's a lot of different uses for it, but as far as a long-term source, because we have long, dry summers, the refill of those tanks generally is not enough during the summer when you need the water. So you're a lot better to plumb them into your, let's say, into your laundry, use it for dishwashers, or ideally use it for flushing toilets. And then that way you're using the water in a smart way, and it's not being wasted. Alfred, you've got new turf in. Can I water by hose 2 times a day, or is this only for sprinklers? No. Look, Alfred, if you've put new turf in, it needs to be given a good wash in when it's put in. One of the first things is you put the turf down. It should be on a sand base, and it should have been compacted. So it's pushed the roots into the sand, and then it's given one good soak. And then when you've got conditions like we've got here, where there's more rainfall coming through, you don't need to supplement the water. Just watch it carefully. It does depend on what variety you've got. Some varieties are certainly better than others, but at the moment, I would not be supplementary watering your turf at all. It's going to rain this afternoon. Over the next week or so, I was just having a look at these numbers just before. Over the next week or so, we are expecting Here in Perth, 14, we're 30, 45. We have got close to 50 mils of rain due in the next 7 days or so. This is the time to let the rainfall get your turf going. You don't need to supplementary water it. Whew. We've got lots of questions coming through. It's great. It's great to have you join us. Thanks so much for joining us on the show today. Now, earlier on, I mentioned Guildford Town Nursery, and one of our great friends is Jo from Guildford Town. She is a passionate West Australian garden centre owner. She's been helping WA gardeners get the best results for a long period of time. And Guildford is a very interesting area, very old area in the state, probably the oldest, I think, is where the first settlers really started producing a lot of food and based themselves as they came off the Swan River. So some of the gardens there are quite old. There are a lot of good lessons there, and Jo has been able to share those because she's a local with not just the people in her local area, but a lot of people who travel to Guildford Town Nursery because of its extensive range of plants. So I asked her a little bit about hydrozoning. And if you don't know the concept of hydrozoning, it's one of these Waterwise principles that the Water Corporation introduced back probably in 2004, 2005, as we started to research and understand that, look, a lot of us want to have plants that don't necessarily originate from the area that we live in. We want to bring in plants that are exotic to that area to have beautiful gardens. Some people want a rose garden or a cottage garden, but can that be done in a water-wise way? And hydrozoning is the way you do it. So you have different stations, irrigation stations, dedicated to different groupings of plants that have the same water requirement. And for example, the water you put on a garden bed for roses will be a lot less than you would put on a lawn, which will require a little bit more water. So that's the concept of hydrozoning for a start. So putting the right plants in the right spot. The question I asked Jo was, what should you be planting in your garden? And there's another complexity to that, and that is the different types of soils. So Jo made a few suggestions because out there at Guildford, there's some quite heavy soils, and then not far from her, you've got Bassendean sands, which are considered by the World's Food Organization as some of the most impoverished soils in the world. So some of us have got a real challenge. So Jo suggested for clay, Salvia leucantha. Now, it was interesting because that was one Matt mentioned before. And one of the reasons why it's so good is it comes from Mexico. It's known as Mexican sage. Beautiful flowers. There are a few different types these days that give you a little bit of different color. It's something you'll find in her garden centre. Sedum Mini Joy is one that's incredibly popular. Sedums are a succulent plant. Great suggestion, Jo. And this is one that you'll find in all good garden centres. And Callistemon, all aglow. So it's one of those wonderful bottle brushes and like a vibrant iridescent colour. Or a red colour as it produces flower. So great suggestion for clay. 3 great ones for clay. I think we have. I wasn't quite watching as I talked about this, but shared some suggestions there. Showed some photos for sand. It's a lot more challenging in sandy environments. These were the suggestions that Jo put in. Raphiolepis, Snow Maiden. And that's got a beautiful white flower, very, very hardy plant, originates from India and the continent, and it is a really good plant for a water-wise environment. Adenanthus cuneata is called the basket flower. It's a West Australian native, grows in the southwest, really, really beautiful plant, great ground cover. And Cistus purpureus, which is, you probably see it with a big sign. It's got the beautiful pink flowers. Brilliancy is the variety that just does so well. Great for sandy soils. Of course, a lot of us are growing fruit trees. And if you want to grow fruit trees that are really good, Jo's recommended olives. Can't go wrong. And you can have oil or you can have pickling olives. They're different types of fruit. Mulberries. There's white, Lena, and Black English. Black English is by far my favourite. The white, I have 2 white at home, and beautiful, delicious fruit, big, long, sweet fruit. They're about 95% sugar, those ones. So don't have too many, you'll get hyperactive. And right at the moment, we're just seeing in the Perth Hills, the almonds are just about to burst into flower. And she suggested all in one. So it's a self-fertile variety. And as far as deciduous trees go, so we're about to move into spring. We're going to see some beautiful deciduous trees: Prunus bleriana, Pyrus nivalis, and Ulmus parvifolia. That's a foliage tree, really good. The other two produce wonderful spring flowering. So 3 great trees to add to your collection. You can see pictures of them there. That's great. Wow, that's pretty good. Now, remember, of course, if you do want to find out a little bit more about these trees, go to your local Waterwise garden centre. You can head to the Water Corporation's website. They've got a great plant tool at watercorporation.com.au/plants. Put that into your computer and put it as a favourite, because it's a great reference tool. The guys and girls at the Water Corporation put so much effort into providing sort of really good information that's relevant to local environment. It's a wonderful resource, and there's not too many resources quite like it. How are we going? We've had a bit of a regular flow of questions coming through. I've got more flowing through. Remember, hit the like button. It's the best way to share it with your friends. Not only are you sharing the solutions to your garden problems with them, but it gives them the opportunity also to be able to ask questions as well. Where shall we go? Waterwise front garden. Here we go. Margaret, this is a good question. What about a Waterwise front garden? Unfortunately, it's a struggle, so we can't put anything on our verge without council approval. Now, I'm not sure where you are, Margaret, but many councils now are encouraging the removal of turf on the verge to be replaced with West Australian native plants, ideally endemic plants to our local area. So I'm not sure whether that is 100% correct, because there's been so many of them that have changed for the positive in recent times. And there's some great information, again, about Waterwise verges. In fact, I remember a few years ago we did a series of programs called Green Fingers, which we put on television, and we just went across the Perth metro area and we literally transformed verges. And I can't quite remember the amount of water, but there was some research done. I think it was about 20,000 litres of water is spent on watering verge lawns per house on average per year. It's some crazy amount of water that if you're putting in native plants and you're getting them established now, so you rip your turf out now, you literally, in many cases, some people can just spray the turf out, because these, once it's dead, it acts as a bit of a mulch into the soil as well. And you can plant natives in around the outside, put some mulch over the top, and you've transformed your front verge. You've provided, a food source for things like bees and birds, but you've beautified your verge as well in the same way, and massively reduced your water bill by taking that need to water during summer away. That's a bit of advice for you. Isabel is in Duncraig. I'd really like to know what plants suit my soil type here in Duncraig. Isabel, you know what? The best thing to do is grab a sample of your soil, and the way you do it is you take 100 mil deep pocket. So most of the feeder roots of plants actually sit in the top 100 mils. Take literally a little a cut of that soil out, take it to your local garden centre and say, right, this is my soil. Generally in Duncraig, they're going to look at it and go, wow, it's very sandy. You're going to need to incorporate some Waterwise water-saving products. That's usually soil improvers. So, go and check out the website, but there's companies like Bailey's that have the stamp, and their soil improvers are a very rich source of organics. There's also products like soil sulfur, which is a clay. You can put that into the soil, and it's a permanent amendment. So once you've amended your soil with clay, with kaolin clay, soil sulfur, you'll never have to do that again. It will always remain a good, strong, healthy soil, because you've actually changed the structure of the soil. It's very, very clever, and it's just working with Mother Nature the best way you can. And it's West Australian. It's gardening our way. Let's have a look. Olive, I'm not sure, in Ardros. I've got a Tibouchina plant. The leaves have just fallen off. Is it going to die, or can I do anything to keep it living? Tibouchina is probably, for those of you who don't know, there's a number of really beautiful, they're a beautiful big blue flower or purple flower. It's a general comment. Some of them have, all of them have like a furry foliage. They're a shrub. The best place to see them is somewhere like Sydney. And there's a bit of a lesson in that. So Sydney's climate in some ways is similar to ours. It's warmer generally during the winter. They don't get the frosts. And you're in Ardros, so you're probably getting some cold breeze coming in from the ocean as well, which is probably not helping. The other thing about Tiburtinas is that they love water during the summer. So if you're going to grow Tiburtinas, you need to grow them in a pocket of your garden. When we talked about hydrozoning before, a pocket of your garden that has plants which are, I suppose, of a similar demand when it comes to moisture during the summer. Tiburtinas are used to getting summer rainfall. They actually they grow best. The best breeding ever done, I think, in the world of Tiburtinas was done in northern New South Wales, southern Queensland. They get amazing results there because they've got lots of natural rainfall in the warmer time of the year, and they love the humidity. So we've got a few things going against us here. I think the cold is what's affected your plant, though, and I think a little bit of mulching with a bit of straw around the base of it at the moment will warm the soil as the straw starts to break down. And then once you get into the spring proper, you'll see that it'll start to send out new shoots, and it's the time that you'll give it a feed. If you're looking for plants for your verge, it's worthwhile mentioning this again. Go to thewatercorporation.com.au. Check out they're creating a Waterwise verge information page. It's a really good resource, and that's what I've been saying about this website. It's a great resource for you to be able to go back and help you with your typical West Australian garden problems. And our gardening is unlike anywhere else in the world, I would say. So you do need that local advice, and that's what that resource is there. I don't know whether you follow our Facebook page on a regular basis, but I've got a lot of bananas at home, a lot of them growing, and they've been producing huge amounts of fruit right in the middle of winter. And you can see just over my shoulder here, there's that, and that's one I picked, the big bunch I picked this morning. Is that there? There. And you can see a photograph here as well. So we've got lots of bananas coming through. Bananas are good for you in so many different ways. One of the things is that they release endorphins that make you happy. So it's the happy fruit. So make sure that you're growing bananas. They will grow, but here's the trick with them. They're an under canopy plant. They've got basically they're the world's biggest. They're not a tree. They're the world's biggest herb. So they're herbaceous. So in the ground, they have the ability to store in their modified root system huge amounts of moisture, which sustain the growth. The trick is that you actually let them grow during the winter with the winter rains. You don't need to use summer to over supplement the water. And if you are going to grow them, if you can use recycled water, grey water, even better. They love it. One of my good friends, she had the most amazing bananas in Shenton Park, and literally it was water coming from the kitchen sink. She just rechanneled it straight to the banana. Jill has asked about the bananas. She said, how do you feed them and how often? Well, look, I don't feed them a lot, but I have been using a West Australian plant food. It's a special plant food called Trev. It's got a lot of minerals and it's about 60 micro and macronutrients sitting in this particular plant food. It's controlled release. So we were talking with Matt Lunn earlier on about releasing nutrients steadily. Plants are like us. We need a small amount every day. Give us too much and we're sick. Give us too little, we're sick. Small amounts every day, we're healthy and we're growing strongly. And if we've got all the nutrients that we need, and this is really important for plants that you eat, is to make sure you've got a really well-balanced fertilizer. That's why those 60 micro and macronutrients are so important. If you've got them going into the soil, if you're feeding the soil and the plant's taking those nutrients and you're eating the produce, you're getting those nutrients. It is the food chain. It is a cycle that goes through, and we benefit from that. If you don't have those nutrients, that's why you need calcium tablets, or that's why you need to take magnesium tablets. Those kinds of things should be in the food that you grow. They can only be in the food you grow if you've put it into the soil in the fertilizers, because once it's taken out, it needs to be replaced. That's the thing about growing food at home, is it's intensive farming. You do need to replace those nutrients. They don't just magically appear. Throwing compost on alone will not do the job. You do need to resupplement it. And as far as feeding goes, by using that Trev, which has also got beneficial soil microbes in it, I only need to feed maybe twice a year. It's probably what I'm doing at the moment. And the growth is phenomenal. The questions flowing in about growing bananas is incredible now. So Ken's asked another question. So Jill, I hope that helped you with feeding. Ken wants to know, will they grow in a hothouse? Absolutely. They'll grow really well in a hothouse environment. There's a really good garden centre down in the southern suburbs, just near Canning Vale. It's a specialist hydroponic nursery called Aquaponics WA. They've got a big plastic house there, and go and have a look at the bananas growing in large pots there. It's incredible to see how they grow, and they'll continue growing through the winter, whereas mine at home have pretty much stopped growing, and the only energy they're putting into or using at the moment is going into the fruit. So that's why I'm getting these huge big bunches. And if you look at that particular one, you'll see it's bright green, and I've picked them green. The reason I picked them green is one of my nutritionist friends, Julie Meek, will tell you that green bananas are so much better for you to eat. But two is that they need to actually be exposed to a lot of sunlight. Then that's when the sugars are released within the fruit. So during the winter, you're not getting a lot. And certainly in July, we didn't get a lot. So picking them greens is fine. And one of the reasons Julie says it's so good is they're a prebiotic. It's actually essential to have really good gut health. And this is your prebiotic dose, or a great way to do it. What it means is the fiber in these bananas, it breaks down a lot slower in your gut, which builds up your microbial gut health, something that's very important. And some of us eat yogurt for that reason. Well, this is another way to do it that's really good for you. Kay's also asked about bananas. We've started something here. How long after planting do they take to fruit? She's had hers for 12 months, and it's quite big, but there's no sign of flowers. So they'll tend to flower in the latter part of summer. So into the autumn, you should see flowers produced, but they will not produce fruit. So mine were producing fruit 18 months after planting a fresh sucker in. And one of the interesting things is I mentioned that they're a herb, right? So they're not a tree. So the big stem that grows up and produces the fruit, the bunch of fruit, once you've harvested the fruit, that stem's dead. It's finished. It's going to die back down. So you cut that off and a new sucker will emerge. And within 12 months after that, that will start producing fruit. So once you've got your base right, the plant's age is right, you'll start getting regular production. And I'm going to take a rough guess, but I reckon I've got at least 10 bunches that weigh 20 kilo or 15 kilos each. So I'm probably exaggerating, 15 kilos each. So 20 bunches by 15 kilos, you can do the numbers. There's 300 kilos of bananas. So I should be able to be happy and keep everybody around me happy for some period of time. How's that? We have gone through so many questions. Now, I think we've run out of time, which is it's incredible. It's 90 minutes. We've just been going flat out. If anybody had ever told you that I cannot talk underwater with a mouthful of marbles, you now know that they're not telling the truth. I definitely can. I'm here to make your gardening life so much easier, I suppose, and more successful, and to share good, down-to-earth, practical Waterwise gardening advice. Thanks so much for joining us on today's The Garden Gurus live session. It's been great having you join us. There's a big thank you to today's sponsor. We've had a consistent theme all the way through. This is produced just for WA, and the Water Corporation are the ones that have made it possible. So we're very grateful for their support. Remember, if you want any more Waterwise advice, all you have to do is go to go to www.watercorporation.com.au and /Waterwise, and that'll take you straight into the section of the website that'll help you with your Waterwise gardening tips, hints, and ideas. It's a really good resource, and you can find, Waterwise garden centres. You can find irrigation tips. You can find things like, Waterwise plants, the right suggestions for your particular garden situation. Now, just reading through the last few notes that I need to share with you. Michaela will send a message to our prize winners after today's show. Everybody's getting something today. We've had these beautiful books to give away. We've had packet seeds, obviously great information along the way. The Garden Gurus is coming back to Channel 9 very soon. It'll be back on your TV screens within just a couple of weeks. We're not too far away. Remember, you can always jump onto our website as well and catch up with previous stories from the Garden Gurus at thegardengurus.tv or on our YouTube channel, which is thegardengurus.tv. You can listen back to today's live stream and catch up on previous episodes of this particular show that we've produced on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Audible. And we will be back on Monday. So make sure you tune in at 10 a.m. Western Standard Time. That's 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time for all of our interstate guests. Happy gardening. Have a great weekend, everybody, and thanks for joining us.
This live stream is brought to you by the Water Corporation. Western Australia has its own unique climate, and with that comes its own set of challenges, particularly when it comes to creating a beautiful garden. Water Corporation has a wealth of resources to help master your garden, including a Waterwise plant directory, irrigation tips, and popular garden designs. To find out more, visit watercorporation.com.au/Waterwise.